This video will address some of the introductory archaeological methods, primarily surveys and excavations. How do we find archaeological sites and how do we dig them up? As we go through the semester, we will see other ways or other methods that are more precise than this, but this gives us the general ones, and we'll go into more precise methods as we move along. But needless to say, there's a lot of archaeological sites that have never really been lost. The Athenian Acropolis of the upper right, bottom right, the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, and more recent finds, where there's a cemetery here. This is an old cemetery. We can still see the skulls on the top with wings. And we'll talk about these as we go through the semester, but these are obvious sites. There's many more of them. There's like Mesa Verde in the American Southwest, these cliff dwellers that I will come back to later on in the course, and how, when Europeans got here, they, found these sites completely abandoned. Or more recently, that is to say, within the last 120 years, the discovery of cave paintings from the Upper Paleolithic. Excuse me. And I'll lecture a lot on these as well. Though discovered more recently, they were always preserved for us and required no digging to find. But most archaeological sites aren't that way. And we have to do what is called field surveys. And that's where people line up at some sort of distance between themselves, 10 feet, 20 feet, depending on what you want, and walk in straight lines across the field looking for artifacts, primarily pottery sherds and stone tools. If there was architecture there, well, that would have been seen already. Now, this might be surprising for you that people could find such stuff by just walking around, but if you go to places where people have lived for many, many thousands of years, there's a lot of sites out there. Here's another shot of people walking through the field. For example, if you go to the Mediterranean, you'll usually find, on one day of field survey and systematic field walking, there's a good chance you're going to find at least a small Roman site, because the Romans went everywhere, as well as much older sites. And it really just requires that you know what you're looking for. That's really important here. And a lot of people walk right over archaeological remains and haven't a clue that that's what they're looking at. Now here we see, I want you to focus first on the right. And you can see some pottery there that in the soil laying around, as well as there's some seashells, etc. These are a bit clean for you because I probably cleaned up a little bit for this photograph and put back into the dirt. But that's basically what you're looking for. We'll talk about the beginning of pottery production in the early Holocene. But when you make a pot, you've made something that will last forever. So these things are frequently found, especially in places like in Greece or Igo or throughout the Mediterranean, where people have been producing pottery for 7,000 to 8,000 years at least. Now on the bottom center, you can see, those. I don't know if you can see the sherd there. There's a little round handle here. There's another fragment there and there, and you got to acquire an eye for these things. On the left are some stone tools. This is an exception. This is really a rich site here, and been sort of cleaned off for us. But there are stone tools laying around. We'll talk about obsidian tools later on, and things made out of flint, which are easier to see. And in this top center, these are some things that you might find on a surface. We see some pottery there on the top. Piece of gold. Well, that's really lucky if you found that. I've never found a piece of gold in all my years, not even on an excavation, let alone on a surface. And then we see some bones and some seashells. In the bottom right there, you see a seashell that's perforated, so it's probably made for a necklace of some sort. And so we look for those things, and you'd be really surprised once you're taught how to look, how often these pop up. And then we turn to excavations. And that, if you think the site's rich enough and enough important enough date, and most importantly, answers a problem, okay, then you excavate it. Trust me, there are far more sites to dig than we potentially can right now. A common thing to believe is that we've found everything so far. We haven't. And, there's a lot of, like, let's say, once again, the Romans, a Roman farm site. Well, we have a lot of Roman farm sites. And so, we might want to excavate a different period. It depends on whether you have a question to ask, or if it's a rescue excavation, i.e. it's going to be destroyed by a new dam or something to that effect. And we'll talk about those, and we'll see great examples from Egypt when they built the dam at Aswan, and the monuments they had to save there. Now, primarily, the most important thing about excavating is it be systematic. Back in the day, way back when, people just sort of went to these mounds, tells, or where they found things in the ground, and just were treasure hunters, looking for them, looking for anything and everything, and things to sell or things to take to the museums, etc. Now we like to excavate in squares and leave the walls in between the squares, which are called bulks, and I'll come back to that later. Some sites, these ones look to be about 5 meter by 5 meter. At some sites, they're even bigger, 10 by 10. Some of them, like my last excavation, was 1 meter by 1 meter. And that way you could map everything in and control where everything was found, and just be very, very careful. And then, as we see on the right, you can then lay little grids over, let's say you have a 5 by 5, lay grids over top of that if you want things to be even more detailed. And these can help with photography and when you're drawing and taking measurements. And once again, I pull out on the left here just to show you some squares, and you see the walls in between the trenches. Well, those are called bulks. They didn't really start until about the 1930s. A guy by the name of Mortimer Wheeler started using these when he excavated the Indus River Valley. And what they allow us to do is see levels of floors that we potentially might dig through. I mean, a lot of times, these things aren't paved, they're just dirt floors, and you might miss them. But these things will preserve the stratigraphy and will allow us, they usually get drawn at the end of a project to allow us what the sequence of deposition is. And here we see another example on the top there of the grid put over a square trench, and we can see the little pickaxe, hand axe of the one square there, just to show you how to be systematic. On the bottom right, you can see the different stratigraphy there. How it goes sort of a fine red into a stony orange, and then a very stony, darkish red. And theoretically, as you're digging down, you want to stop at each one of these, but sometimes that's easier said than done. So you leave the bulk up, the wall in between the trenches, to help you, and to help you with future trenches. Now, once again, we have our stratigraphy. I'm sorry that this slide's a little fuzzy, but this is, the geological history of the whole planet, basically, going, way back when. We just have to start ourselves in the top 3. And the Pliocene really just at the, sort of in the middle or the end of that. And then the Pleistocene, the period of the ice ages, which I talked about in the previous film. And we'll continue to talk about this. This is where our ancestors evolved over time. And then the Holocene, the period since the last ice ages, and when farming started and urbanism started. And we can see in our little diagram here, and then we get to people, like we are, with trucks, et cetera, et cetera. But you can see just how little time we take up in the whole span of world history. We are just like a little, section in a line of, a mile long. We just have a little bit at the end. And so that's important to keep in mind. Okay, and here, once again, back to stratigraphy. And here's a real nice example on the left where you can really see the colors change. And geez, I wish every archaeological site were that clear. But it really gives you an idea of superimposed stratigraphy. That is to say, what's on the bottom is earlier than what's above it. And we can see that on the upper right, where just what they call metrical stratification. Well, that's just an ideal stratigraphy. Things are never that flat, but the first top ones you might excavate that way because you don't know what the stratigraphy is going to be. So you might say, listen, we'll excavate 10 centimeters down and see what happens, and then another 10 centimeters. And then if things start developing, you can be a bit more careful. And so we see the natural stratification in the center that, these lines aren't straight across, but they undulate or they lens out, as we see in number 4, it sort of dies out. And then, as is shown on the right, but better displayed on the bottom right, is the simple fact is that people put walls into these soils, and they cross-cut the stratigraphy, or they dig wells, etc. And one of the things that can cause is what's called reverse stratigraphy, where when the ancients dug out a well, they dug into cultural remains below them, and then when they dumped them to the side of the well, they basically reversed the stratigraphy. And this is when things start getting really, really hard to figure out. And you got to be really careful when you're excavating these. And so these are some general ideas of, how to proceed through an excavation. And here's an example of where the stratigraphy is not much help at all. Or there is stratigraphy this, but you got to be really careful. And it's primarily just the difference in little rocks and pebbles there, but this soil's all white. And so, sometimes this is what you're confronted with. Once again, we see the use of the bulks on the left there. The ones in the middle there, for some reason, that team cut out, but you can see it in between there. On the bottom one, we see some, these deeper excavations. This was a pottery producing site, but that looks quite ancient, Roman or earlier. The walls above, but below they found these artifacts in situ. And in situ means in where they were left, in place. And this is actually quite common. Especially in the old world. And these people put boards there so they don't step on the artifacts as much. One of the interesting things about digging, I found from some of the good old excavators, these guys have been on excavations for decades, is they go in bare feet. And because bare feet, quite frankly, won't damage anything like boots will. And you can just see how close quarters there are, and how tightly these pots are. And notice when you see a white tag on them, they all get individually labeled in sequential numbers. We'll talk more about that, but trust me, in these when you're on these sites and you're finding a lot, you can quickly get up to new archaeological find number 4022 and stuff like that. It adds up really quick. Now, also, as we dig, we take out the dirt and we use what's called a shaker sieve. This is actually my funnest job. I think it's the funnest job on archaeology. Let's look at the right for the moment. And that is, you take the dirt and you put it in this screen and you shake it. And the soil comes out of the bottom, and on the top remains any stones, and pottery and work stones, etc., any cultural remains. There will also be a lot of unworked stones in it, and you have to pick through it and find what's in there. But you see, the archaeological finds can be quite small, and you could miss them with just a shovel of dirt, and you don't want to shovel that dirt away and perhaps miss a small but important find. So you put things through a shaker sieve. On the left, we see people using it as well. It's interesting what they're doing there is they're doing these what are called shovel trenches. You do this a lot in North America, where you're making sure that when you build something, there are no cultural remains on it. We'll talk more about that when we talk about cultural resource management. But they're basically just testing the area. They go down, so many feet every, I don't know, whatever they're doing, every 10 feet or so. And then you put it through a sieve and see if you have anything. And if nothing's there, then people are allowed to build. And one of the things happens when you find all this pottery is you get conservators, people who put together these three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles. And you got to have a good eye for this stuff. This stuff is, it's one of these things that's fun to do at first, but then after, a couple hours of looking at the same pile of sherds and only finding 2 or 3 that go together, as we say, when you find a join, find 2 or 3 to go together, it starts to get pretty tedious. And every archaeologist has a story of working on a sherd table and trying to find joins. And then somebody just, breezes on by and notices that 2 joined together. They were right in front of you. And so it's hard to do. And the places where it is that you don't have any sherds, you fill it in with this clay of another color, or plasters on the left, so people know what's real and what isn't. This is interesting because when we go way back, archaeologists tried to make the whole pot look like it was original. And so, only a specialist could tell where the original sherd ended and the rest of the pot began. We don't do that anymore. If you're good at this sort of thing, archaeology is looking for people like you, because it's tough to do. And you have to know your pottery really well, because if you know what shape, a fragment will be on or belong to, then it helps a lot. And pottery specialists, these people were just amazing. They can look at just like a fragment of what we see here and say, oh, this comes from such and such a vessel, or this comes from such and such a vessel. And that takes years and years of studying, and studying in just one region, because once you go to another country, the pottery styles will change. Now, one other type of sieving is very important. It's called water sieving. And this is a method that's more recent than the ones I just showed you. And it started, I guess, around the 50s or 60s. It didn't come into Greece until the 60s, at least. And this is what you do. The shaker sieve I showed you before has the problem that it won't find seeds. And so you take the soil, you take a sample of soil, because this is very time intensive. And so it's hard to do all the soil. But what you do is you take like one of the buckets of soil there and you put it into this big barrel. Now, how this barrel is arranged is that there is a mesh on top, and you can see that held with clothespins. And then there's a whole barrel full of water. And it's just enough water that it bubbles above where that sieve is by just a few inches. It doesn't bubble out of the vessel, of the barrel, but just a few inches, in order to wetten the soil and the sediments and make them sink. And what doesn't sink are seeds. And so eventually they'll float to the top, and then they'll come off to that little entrance, no, not entrance, but this, area here at the front, which lets the water out, and it goes down to even a finer mesh. And that saves whatever seeds there are, and they get dried out. And then you get things like this on the left, little seeds. And they can tell you what people are eating. And this is really, really, really important. But it's also a really hard thing. These are people that study these seeds are called paleoethnobotanists, or paleobotanists, or people who study botany of old seeds. And they can tell what seed is for what plant, which is pretty hard to do. But it gives us an enormous amount of information. This is my least favorite job on an excavation, because it's really, really tedious. But the information is extraordinarily important. And we've learned so much now that these are being regularly used in archaeology. Then, you have to do things like map the site. Now there you look at, using, I think, an old theodolite there with a bubble level. A theodolite, perhaps none of you know what it is. It's an old surveyor's tool. before we had sort of computers that could do it. And you stand with a what's called a stadia rod. I'll show you one later. But basically, it's a big ruler, a big measuring stick. And the surveyor would be, somewhere else away, far away, and he or she would look through the telescope and see what the level is where you are and be able to make topographic maps, as we see here, or then draw in walls, what have you. But you have to map the terrain. You have to know what the site looks like. If you get architecture, you have to be able to draw that in. These are all much easier now, but you have to know your computers well. There's things called electronic distant measures. And I'm sure you've seen these on guys who work on the roads, on the side of the roads, et cetera, where they have basically a computer that shoots out a laser. And there's a person standing far away. And instead of having this long, tall ruler, they just have a prism. And somehow, this laser hits it and bounces back or something, how it works is beyond me. But it tells you how far away it is, what the elevation is. That is to say, what the bottom, how far, the bottom of the stick is, where it's touching the ground, etc. Basically, what you do is you take the measurements and then you have to subtract the distance of that, of that arm that's holding the prism, or the staff that's holding the prism. So you make maps and you catalog a lot. Usually what happens is, you dig from about 7 in the morning to about 1 in the afternoon. At least in the summers in the Med this way. After 1, it's just way too hot. It's just too hot. Archaeology is an early morning thing because that's when it's cool. So, you work till 1:30 to have lunch, and then you'll spend a couple hours every afternoon cataloging sherds, stone tools, like we see in the bottom right, keeping notes, and then having people draw them. And illustrators are very important for archaeology. They are also good illustrators are few and far between. If any of you are good at drawing, you'll be very valuable in archaeological excavations. However, you have to know what you're looking at. So you do have to know something about archaeology. You have to know what the pottery looks like, what the stone tools look like, et cetera. But then you have to be able to make 2-scale drawings. Now, these ones in the bottom right are life size, but if you have a large vessel, you can't do that life size. So you do it to scale. So you'll say, every inch equals, a foot, let's say. Well, you have to be good. You have to know what you're doing to do that. And good drawings are very important. Once again, this is all changing with technology. They now have this stuff. I haven't used it yet, but I've seen other people use it, where they basically just take photographs of sherds and put them, and the computer basically puts them together themselves and assesses them. And it's pretty impressive. It doesn't put them together themselves, but it helps a lot. It makes things a lot faster. And then finally, you have to publish. This is the big problem in archaeology. The big sin in archaeology is to dig a site and not publish it. And so at that point, it's lost forever. Because at least if you didn't dig it, somebody could come in the future and dig it. So it's a really big responsibility to excavate. Starcar is a site, an Ice Age site in Scotland that we'll talk about. We can see Stonehenge in the back there. But publication is the final result. And if you're a professional, this is what gets you the respect. And it's quite important. Okay, we'll dig into details of that as we go through the semester, but I wanted to show you how we find these sites.